What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest stars walks onto a morning show set and refuses to play by the rules? When carefully crafted questions meet raw, unfiltered responses? When a legendary actor decides he has had enough of the same old narrative being pushed about his career, his choices, and his legacy? This morning on Good Morning America, viewers witnessed something they never expected to see. John Travolta, the man who danced his way into our hearts, who flew jets and sang his way through decades of cinema, sat across from George Stephanopoulos, and what started as a standard promotional interview quickly became one of the most uncomfortable, tension-filled exchanges in morning television history. Before we get into what actually went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about celebrities pushing back against tough interview questions. Now let's dive into how this interview went completely off the rails. The interview began innocently enough. Travolta walked onto the set with his signature smile, that charm that has captivated audiences for generations. Stephanopoulos greeted him warmly, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. They discussed Travolta's latest project, a film that marked his return to a particular style of role that fans had been waiting years to see him tackle again. The conversation flowed smoothly as Travolta spoke about his preparation for the character, the physical training he underwent, and his excitement about working with the director. But then Stephanopoulos shifted gears. He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious, more journalistic. He brought up the subject that everyone in the industry had been whispering about for months, but few had directly confronted Travolta about on camera. The box office disappointments, the string of films over the past decade that failed to connect with audiences the way his earlier work had. The critics who suggested that perhaps Travolta's time as a leading man had passed. Travolta's smile faded. Not dramatically, not in an obvious way that would make for a cheap viral moment, but there was a shift in his eyes, a hardening. He sat back in his chair and there was a pause, just long enough to feel uncomfortable, before he responded. His voice was measured, controlled, but there was an edge to it that had not been there moments before. He told Stephanopoulos that he found it interesting how the conversation always seemed to circle back to failure when discussing his recent work. Interesting how the narrative was always about what did not succeed, rather than the artistic choices he made, the risks he took, the stories he wanted to tell regardless of whether they would make hundreds of millions of dollars. He pointed out that he had been in this industry for over 4 decades, that he had experienced highs and lows that would break most people, and that he was still here, still working, still passionate about his craft. Stephanopoulos, to his credit, did not back down. He clarified that he was not trying to focus on failure, but rather asking about how Travolta viewed this particular chapter of his career in context with his earlier massive successes. He mentioned the iconic roles, the cultural impact of Saturday Night Fever and Grease and Pulp Fiction, and asked whether Travolta felt pressure to recapture that lightning in a bottle. That is when Travolta's demeanor really changed. He leaned forward now, his voice rising slightly but still controlled. He said that this was exactly the problem with these kinds of interviews. The constant comparison, the implication that unless he was at the absolute peak of cultural relevance, he was somehow diminished. He asked Stephanopoulos directly whether he thought artists should only be valued for their biggest commercial successes or whether there was merit in the journey, in the evolution, in the willingness to keep creating even when the spotlight was not as bright. Stephanopoulos tried to reframe, saying that was not what he meant, that he had tremendous respect for Travolta's body of work. But Travolta cut him off, not rudely but firmly. He said he had heard this response before, this walk back, this attempt to soften the blow after asking a question designed to get exactly the kind of defensive reaction it provoked. He said he was tired of playing the game where interviewers got to ask pointed questions about perceived decline, and then act surprised when the subject did not just smile and nod along. The studio had gone quiet. You could sense the producers off camera tensing up, wondering whether to cut to commercial, whether to intervene. But both men were professionals, and this was live television, and there was nowhere to hide. Stephanopoulos gathered himself and posed another question, this time about Travolta's choices in recent years, to take on certain roles in smaller, independent films rather than chasing major studio blockbusters? Travolta's response was sharp. He said that phrasing it as choices versus chasing revealed a bias in the question itself, as if wanting to work on projects that mattered to him personally, projects with filmmakers he respected, stories that challenged him as an actor, was somehow a consolation prize because he could not get the big roles anymore. He looked directly into the camera, not at Stephanopoulos, and said that maybe the problem was not with actors who evolved and took risks, but with an industry and a media culture that could only understand success in terms of opening weekend numbers and franchise potential. Stephanopoulos was visibly taken aback by that response. He paused, regrouping, and then attempted to steer the conversation toward what he called a more constructive direction. He mentioned that Travolta had been very open in past interviews about his personal struggles, about loss and grief and finding his way back to work after tragedy. He asked whether those experiences had changed Travolta's relationship with fame and success. This was the moment when the temperature in the room truly changed. Travolta's jaw tightened. He stared at Stephanopoulos for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice was low but filled with barely contained frustration. He said that bringing up his personal tragedies in the context of a conversation about box office numbers and career trajectory was exactly the kind of exploitation that he had spent years trying to avoid. He said that his grief, his loss, the most painful experiences of his life, were not narrative devices to explain away why his recent films had not performed as well as studios hoped. Stephanopoulos immediately tried to clarify, saying that was not his intention, that he was simply trying to understand the full picture of who Travolta was as both an artist and a person. But Travolta was not having it. He said that the full picture of who he was as a person was none of Stephanopoulos's business and certainly not fodder for a morning television segment sandwiched between cooking, demonstrations, and celebrity gossip. He said that he had agreed to come on the show to talk about his new film, to talk about his work, and instead he was being psychoanalyzed and having his personal pain used as context for his professional choices. The tension was palpable now. Stephanopoulos shifted in his seat, and you could see him calculating his next move. He took a breath and said that he understood Travolta's frustration, but that as a public figure who had chosen to share aspects of his personal life in the past, it was natural for journalists to explore how those experiences shaped his work. He said it was not exploitation, it was journalism. It was trying to give audiences insight into the artists they admire. Travolta laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said that was a convenient argument for someone whose job it was to extract sound bites and emotional moments from people who came onto his show. He said that calling it journalism did not make it any less intrusive, any less calculated. He pointed out that Stephanopoulos had not asked him a single substantive question about the actual film he was there to promote. Not about the themes, not about the director's vision, not about his approach to the character. Instead, the focus had been entirely on his perceived failures and personal tragedies. Stephanopoulos countered by saying that he had started the interview by discussing the film, and that Travolta himself had shifted the tone by taking offense to legitimate questions about his career arc. He said that if Travolta did not want to engage with questions about his work in the broader context of his career, then perhaps he should have made that clear to the producers before agreeing to the interview. He said that pushing back against every question and accusing him of exploitation was not productive and was making it impossible to have any kind of meaningful conversation. Now Travolta leaned forward again, his voice rising for the first time. He said that maybe meaningful conversation was not actually what Good Morning America wanted. Maybe what they wanted was exactly what was happening right now. Conflict, drama, a moment that would be clipped and shared across social media with headlines about John Travolta losing it or John Travolta melting down. He said that Stephanopoulos could sit there and claim journalistic integrity all he wanted, but they both knew that morning television was about ratings and clicks and keeping audiences engaged between commercial breaks. Stephanopoulos's expression hardened. He said that it was unfair for Travolta to question his integrity as a journalist, that he had spent decades building a reputation on asking tough questions and holding people accountable, and that just because Travolta did not like the questions did not mean they were not valid. He said that celebrities did not get to control the narrative completely, that part of being in the public eye was accepting that people would scrutinize your work and your choices. Travolta shot back immediately. He said that there was a difference between scrutiny and condescension, between tough questions and gotcha moments designed to provoke a reaction. He said that Stephanopoulos had come into this interview with a predetermined narrative about his career being in decline, and every question had been crafted to support that narrative regardless of how Travolta responded. He said that was not journalism, that was agenda-driven interviewing, and he was not going to sit there and pretend otherwise just to be polite. The audience in the studio was completely silent now. This had gone far beyond typical interview tension. These were two men, both at the top of their respective fields, both used to being in control, both refusing to give an inch. Stephanopoulos took a moment, clearly trying to decide whether to escalate further or attempt to de-escalate. He chose to push forward. He asked Travolta directly whether he thought all criticism of his recent work was unfair, whether he believed that journalists and critics had some kind of vendetta against him, or whether he could acknowledge that some of the concerns about his career choices were legitimate. He said that defensiveness in the face of honest questions made it seem like Travolta was unable to accept any perspective that did not align with his own view of himself and his work. That question hit differently. You could see it in Travolta's face. This was no longer just about career trajectory or interview tactics. This had become personal. Travolta sat back, and for a moment it seemed like he might actually walk off the set. But he did not. Instead, he composed himself and began to speak in a way that was somehow both calm and intensely passionate. He said that the assumption underlying that question was that criticism equals truth, that if enough people say something, it must be valid. He said that he had been in this industry long enough to know that criticism often had nothing to do with the actual quality of work, and everything to do with trends, with cultural moments, with what critics needed to write about to stay relevant themselves. He said that he was not defensive about honest critique of his performances, but what he refused to accept was the narrative that, because his recent films had not been massive commercial successes, he was therefore failing or flailing or desperately clinging to relevance. Travolta continued, his voice gaining strength. He said that he had made choices in his career that prioritized artistic fulfillment over guaranteed paychecks. He had worked with young filmmakers who needed a name to help get their projects financed. He had taken roles that scared him, that pushed him outside his comfort zone, that might not have been safe bets but felt important to him as an artist. And yes, some of those films did not connect with wide audiences. Some of them were critically dismissed. But he was proud of that work. He was proud of taking risks. And he resented the implication that unless he was starring in $100 million franchise films, he was somehow a cautionary tale about faded glory. Stephanopoulos let him finish, then responded by saying that no one was calling him a cautionary tale, that Travolta was putting words in his mouth and creating an argument that Stephanopoulos had not made. He said that asking an actor to reflect on different phases of their career was standard practice in interviews, and that Travolta's reaction was disproportionate to the actual questions being asked. He suggested that perhaps Travolta was projecting his own insecurities onto questions that were intended to be straightforward and professional. The word insecurities hung in the air like a bomb. Travolta's eyes flashed with anger. He said that Stephanopoulos did not know him well enough to psychoanalyze him on national television. He said that confidence and insecurity had nothing to do with calling out lazy journalism that relied on tired narratives about aging actors and diminished star power. He said that if Stephanopoulos wanted to have a real conversation about the film industry, about how it treats artists over 50, about how the system is designed to churn through talent and spit people out when they are no longer considered profitable, then they could have that conversation. But framing legitimate critique of that system as personal insecurity was dismissive and intellectually dishonest. Stephanopoulos responded that they were having that conversation, or at least they were trying to, but that Travolta kept deflecting any question that required self-reflection by turning it into an attack on journalism or the industry at large. He said that taking responsibility for one's own career choices, acknowledging when things had not worked out as hoped, was not the same as admitting failure. It was maturity. It was growth. And refusing to engage with that level of honesty made the conversation feel performative rather than substantive. Travolta looked at him incredulously. He said that Stephanopoulos had some nerve talking about honesty and substance, when the entire premise of morning show interviews was superficiality. He said these shows brought celebrities on for 7 or 8 minute segments, asked them pre-approved questions, expected them to smile and be charming and plug their projects. And the moment someone deviated from that script, the moment someone pushed back or challenged the format, they were accused of being difficult or defensive. He said the hypocrisy was stunning. He went further. He said that Stephanopoulos built a career on being seen as the serious journalist on the morning show circuit, the one with the political background and the hard-hitting interview style. But at the end of the day, he was still doing puff pieces with movie stars and asking the same recycled questions that every other entertainment journalist asked. And when those movie stars did not play along, when they refused to feed into the narrative that had been predetermined by producers and bookers, suddenly it became about their attitude problem rather than about the quality of the questions being asked. Stephanopoulos' professionalism was cracking now. His voice carried an edge of frustration as he said that Travolta had come on to Good Morning America of his own volition, that no one had forced him to do this interview, and that if he had such contempt for the format and the questions, perhaps he should have declined the invitation. He said that sitting there and insulting the show, insulting him personally, and acting as though he was being victimized by basic interview questions was absurd. He said that plenty of actors, including many of Travolta's peers, had come on the show and managed to have thoughtful, engaging conversations without turning the interview into a confrontation. Travolta smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. He said that maybe those actors were better at playing the game than he was. Maybe they were more willing to swallow their pride and pretend that everything was fine, that every career choice had been perfect, that they had no frustrations with how the industry or the media treated them. He said that he had reached a point in his life where he was not interested in playing that game anymore. He had nothing left to prove. He did not need Good Morning America or any other platform to validate his career. He was there because his team thought it would be good for the film, but clearly that had been a miscalculation. Stephanopoulos took a deep breath, clearly attempting to regain control of the situation. He said that while he appreciated Travolta's honesty, there was a way to express dissatisfaction with interview questions without being disrespectful to the host and the show. He said that they had given Travolta a platform, that millions of people were watching, and that the tone of this conversation had become unnecessarily hostile. He suggested that they try to reset and finish the interview on a more positive note, perhaps by actually discussing the film in more depth. But Travolta was not interested in resetting. He said that the suggestion itself was revealing. The idea that they should just smooth things over, wrap it up neatly, pretend that the last several minutes had not happened. He said that was exactly what was wrong with these formats. Everything had to be packaged and sanitized and made palatable for viewers who might be uncomfortable with genuine conflict or honest disagreement. He said that real conversations were messy. They involved tension and pushback, and moments where people did not agree. And the fact that Stephanopoulos wanted to fast-forward past all of that to get to some artificial conclusion where they shook hands and smiled proved his point about the superficiality of the entire enterprise. Stephanopoulos responded that there was a difference between genuine conversation and grandstanding. He said that Travolta had made his points, had expressed his frustrations with the industry and the media, and had questioned his integrity as a journalist. He asked what more Travolta wanted from this interview. Did he want an apology for asking about his career? Did he want Stephanopoulos to admit that every question had been inappropriate? He said that if Travolta's goal was to make himself look like a victim of unfair media treatment, he was certainly succeeding, but he was not sure that was the impression Travolta actually wanted to leave viewers with. Travolta shook his head. He said that he did not want to be seen as a victim. He wanted to be seen as someone who was willing to call out practices that had become so normalized that people did not even recognize them as problematic anymore. He said that the entire celebrity interview industrial complex was built on a power dynamic where the interviewer controlled the narrative and the subject was expected to be grateful for the exposure. And when that dynamic was challenged, when someone refused to play their assigned role, the response was always to pathologize their reaction rather than examine the system itself. He continued, saying that he knew how this would be covered. He knew that clips of this interview would circulate with headlines about him having a meltdown or being difficult. He knew that the narrative would be about his behavior rather than about the substance of what he was saying. And that was fine. He had been in this business long enough to know how the game worked. But at least he would know that he had been honest. At least he would know that he had not just smiled and nodded and played along with questions that felt designed to diminish him. Stephanopoulos seemed genuinely frustrated now, perhaps even hurt. He said that after all the conversations they had just had, after all the accusations Travolta had leveled at him, did Travolta truly believe that his questions had been asked in bad faith? Did he really think that the goal had been to diminish him rather than to have a substantive conversation about his career and his work? He said that if that was what Travolta believed, then there was probably no point in continuing because they were operating from completely different understandings of what had transpired. Travolta paused. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to consider Stephanopoulos's perspective rather than just reacting to it. He said that he did not think Stephanopoulos personally had malicious intent. He said that he actually believed Stephanopoulos probably thought he was asking fair, reasonable questions. But that was part of the problem. The questions had become so standard, so expected, that no one questioned whether they should be asked in the first place. The focus on box office numbers, the comparisons to past glory, the psychologizing about personal tragedy, all of it was just accepted as normal practice in celebrity interviews. And maybe it was normal, but that did not mean it was right. He said that his frustration was not really with Stephanopoulos as an individual, but with what he represented. The machine that ground down artists and reduced their decades of work to sound bites and narratives about peaks and valleys. He said that every actor over a certain age dealt with this. The constant questions about whether they were still relevant, whether they could still open a movie, whether they had accepted their diminished place in the industry. And those questions wore on you. They shaped how audiences perceived you. They became self-fulfilling prophecies where, if enough people said you were past your prime, eventually it became accepted as fact, regardless of the actual quality of your work. Stephanopoulos listened, and when Travolta finished, he acknowledged that there was validity to some of those points. He said that the media did tend to create narratives that sometimes oversimplified complex careers. He said that the focus on commercial success over artistic merit was a real issue in how entertainment journalism covered the industry. But he also maintained that asking artists to contextualize their current work within their broader career was not inherently unfair, and that refusing to engage with those questions at all made it impossible to have the deeper conversations that Travolta claimed to want. Travolta nodded slowly. He said that maybe they were both right to some degree. Maybe the questions themselves were not the problem so much as the framing, the assumptions built into them. He said that if Stephanopoulos had asked him what he had learned from making films that did not achieve commercial success, or how his approach to choosing roles had evolved, those would have felt like genuine inquiries. But asking about pressure to recapture past glory, or implying that he had been forced into smaller films because bigger opportunities were not available, those framings started from a premise of failure that he fundamentally rejected. Stephanopoulos said that was fair feedback, that perhaps he could have been more thoughtful about his phrasing. He said that this conversation, as uncomfortable as it had been, was actually more interesting and more revealing than most interviews precisely because it had gone off script. He said that he hoped viewers would see it not as a conflict, but as two people grappling with difficult questions about art and commerce and aging and relevance in real time. Travolta allowed himself a small, genuine smile for the first time in several minutes. He said that he appreciated that framing, even if he suspected the actual coverage would be far less generous. He said that despite how heated things had gotten, he respected that Stephanopoulos had not tried to shut him down or cut to commercial when things got tense. He said that was more than he could say for a lot of interviewers who only wanted controversy when they could control it. The interview wrapped shortly after that, with both men visibly exhausted from the exchange. There was no warm goodbye, no friendly handshake for the cameras, just a professional acknowledgement that they had both said what they needed to say, and it was time to move on. So what did we just witness? Was this John Travolta having a breakdown on live television? Or was it an artist finally speaking truth about an industry that chews people up and spits them out? Was George Stephanopoulos asking legitimate journalistic questions? Or was he perpetuating tired narratives about aging actors? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle, which is what made this interview so compelling. Two people, both convinced they were right, both unwilling to back down, having the kind of raw, unscripted conversation that almost never happens on morning television. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the moments that make headlines. And drop a comment below. We want to know, do you think John Travolta was justified in his reaction, or did he take things too far?